Thank you, Rabbi Shuchat, for the warm-up act. So, continuing from where we left off, in the last year, we mainly focused on going through the development of the halacha of the color brown since the Shelas Yavitz was first printed in the mid-1700s, and then the Sidrei Tara after him, and then we went through many chashavim and kairis, both Svarim on Hilchas Nida as well as Shalos and Shuvas, from the years following across Eastern Europe, Galicia, Hungary, Ukraine, Lita, and we're not going to recap everything again. And what we could say is that there was clearly no ungenomene, well-known psak on the topic. And of course, beyond that, we also got a little bit into the Shakla V'Taya, the back and forth. What we did see ultimately is that what the Yavitz and then the Sidrei Tara said was accepted by some of the Poskim with the passage of time, and that this opinion really took off and was accepted by many more Poskim in the Meira Hera, which nothing wrong with that, as we said, until by now it's become almost the most obvious thing in the world. Everyone knows maros, Messiah, although as we saw, it's really from essentially the last 100 years or so.
You didn't mention anybody from Russia, right? Like in what psak in Russia?
Yeah, Lita, Russia.
No, it's revolution in Russia from Russia.
Right, and we see, I quoted from Minute Gavril at the end last time, that the way the stereotype, at least here in America, is that everyone but the Hungarians are Machmer and the Hungarians are Mekel. As we saw from the Svarim themselves, it's not so binary, but that's sort of what the Gas says, that all the Russian Rabbanim are. It's clearly, again, even he says, he heard this Russian Rav, maybe it was Mekel. So it's not 100%, you can't just draw a map and say geographically it breaks down perfectly like this. But I don't know if there's we quoted the Chachmas Adam, is he Russia? Is there Aruch HaShulchan Russia? I have to start looking at the maps. They're all in that area. So, in this share, I would like to go through the new arguments that have really been brought up in the last few decades against the whole psak, the whole heter of the color brown. Dafka based on the earlier Makaitis, Dafka based on what the real kavanah of Chazal and Yishanim was. But before I get to that, there are just a few smaller points that I would like to make to add to what we discussed last time. So number one, the Tzemach Tzedek. We mentioned that there's some kind of discussion regarding what the Tzemach Tzedek holds. So first of all, we have the Piskei Dinim printed in the Tzemach Tzedek. We've already mentioned that already back then, and certainly now, it's more or less been established that these are not, in fact, from the Tzemach Tzedek. Anything that's written in a format of Piskei Dinim, Se'ifim. It was by a Chassid, someone from Adas Chassidei Chabad, but the fact that it was printed in Tzemach Tzedek, of course, gives it extra cheshivas. So if you look in Siman Kuf Tzaddik, Taka, the Sif about the Zayin Samanim, we quoted it at the time and we're going through that. Where he says, Yesh Mishoimer, that the Nashim have Samanim, the Shilti Gibayrim, the Beragayla, the Yesh Mefakbekin, some say not, Dvar Shmuel. So literally the next sentence is, Kasamanei to l'shachar v'neshachar mamish, Yesh l'hakol bay. Kim delaki suri deirais el derabana. If it's only noitel l'shachar, mikol shekain amar noitel l'tzeva brain shu kein klipas armoinim uchamashka akava. Now this essentially is copying and pasting the lashon of the Sidrei Tara, but we mentioned last time there's two shtiklach in the Sidrei Tara. One in Siman Kuf Peches, which is the main place where this is discussed, and it applies to everything. And then again in Siman Kuf Tzaddik, where the context is ksamim specifically, and dafka, that line in the Sidrei Tara and Siman Kuf Tzaddik isn't so clear, because it implies maybe only ksamim, and in fact there were some who wanted to argue that maybe the Sidrei Tara changed his mind, and from Siman Kuf Tzaddik he only holds this din lagabe ksamim. And even though that's not the mainstream understanding when we talk about the shit of the Sidrei Tara, but here in the Piskei Dinim, we only have him quoting the lashon from Siman Kuf Tzaddik. We don't have his Siman Kuf Peches. So it would seem that when that's all we have from the Piskei Dinim, it's difficult to say that we could know what he would have said in Siman Kuf Peches, one way or the other. We have seen Achreidim that were only Mekel and Ksamim, and not in Bedikas. And the main shaila, of course, is B'dikas. So we have this Piskei Din in Tzemach Tzedek, but the information we have from it is limited. He quotes the lashon of the Sidrei Torah that kol shekain, but the context is kesem. So another marker people point to is that in the Shut Tzemach Tzedek, as we know, it was all printed after the passing of the Tzemach Tzedek, and there were Rabbanei Chabad who were involved in preparing it for print and printing it, editing it. So one of the things they included were maftechas to the tshuvas, and by maftechas we mean that there's a paragraph for each tshuva where they summarize the tshuva b'kitzer. And sometimes you'll find small halachics that they added on their own. So in Shut Tzemach Tzedek, Yeridei Siman Kuf Chavdala, there's a tshuva about the chalal, the maros, metamei in the Mishnah. We're actually going to touch on that later. So in the Maftechas, there's a hara in brackets. Mashakasav Sidrei Torah, it's all in Rashi Tevis, but the Mashakasav Sidrei Torah, B'Shem, Matzasi Kasav, V'kein Hu, B'Pischei Tshuva, B'Shem, She'elas Yavitz, Tzarech Iyan. So they seem to be alluding to this. Of course, what's this? What's the Matzasi Kasav? Obviously, it's this. Tzarech Iyan. So what are they trying to say? What's the Tzarech Iyan? Pashtos, like all the early Achreinim who asked questions on it, the question was that we're machmer in every shade of black. So even if you say, like the Sidrei Torah says, b'shem and tzasi kasev, back to the Yavitz, that Deya D'Shachar, all the Achreinim asked, how does Deya D'Shachar help anything? That's presumably the reason why they wrote Tzarech Iyan. The context is they're referring to the Alter Rebbe there in Sif Beis about Shachar, and that we're metamei kol maros Shachar, and then they're saying Mashakasav, Sidrei Torah, etc. Tzarech Iyan. So it seems like these Rabbanei Chabad at least are being knighted to be machmer. They're asking a kasha on the Sidrei Torah based on the Alter Rebbe. And Rabbi Avishid brings this in his treatment of this in Machaneh Michal, and he's mitzayin that Rav Brain already was referred to this in his Haskama to Shmiras Hatara by Rabbi Gadasi. That's where Rabbi Brain has good 2 pages in his unique style going through a lot of these inyanim. So he's mitzayin to this there. So that's a point. That's a point in the on the other column. There's also a tshuva from the Tzemach Tzedek and Siman Kuf Yud Ches about a woman who her maros were kemeit slias basar. A whole discussion to be mekel b'diavad, otherwise l'chatchila not fully clear what we can take from that, but that's also somewhat relevant. But there's another interesting mark in the Tzemach Tzedek that people only paid attention to in recent years. And that is, so there's another interesting makar in Tzemach Tzedek people only noticed recently, and that is the Dafke in Eir Chaim and Siman Tezvav. There's a discussion in Tzemach Tzedek regarding the ink, the black ink for writing stam, and in the middle of that discussion, the Tzemach Tzedek says, "Gabei dam nida she'ach shavim bekiyim b'maros umetamen av deya d'shachar im kol ze metarin green ubloi." I am here today as Siman Kuf Beches u'b'sidrei Torah shom sifkat n'alef kamar brain. Alma de'ein shayachen afil l'deya d'shachar. So the Tzemach Tzedek seems to casually mention, in the context of a discussion of Jiyai, that when it comes to Nida, all these other colors are not associated with black. So Rabbi Avishid writes that, Rabbi Brian Tak and Atzem Askama, Hichriz al Metzia Zu, he announced to the world that this Metzia that he found, it's a nice makar to say that we hold to be Mekel. If you look in the Askama, Rabbi Brian brings that there's a Madura Kama of the Tshuva that was printed in the Miluim, where it seems to say it even more clearly. However, Yesh lahar, Rabbi Avishid says, if you accept this as a good marker, then the context there, Dafka, seems to be not just ksamim, but everything, any re'iyah whatsoever, sounds very good. But Yesh lahar, that Seif Kol Seif, the context is a totally different context. It's not being Isaac in Hilchos Nida, being Isaac in ink. And he wants to be machmer by ink. He wants to say that every other color is not good enough for black ink. Can you say, mamish, that you can be matir and isser chomer by nida based on a discussion over there? So, kosher la'achriya, can't say necessarily that this is, a slam dunk, open and shut. Okay, that's the discussion on the Tzemach Tzedek.
Tzemach Tzedek sounds like the argument to the Yavitz. You're saying you can't do it.
No, he's saying, even if, no. Okay, the Yavitz himself, there's different ways of reading it. He's saying, he says, we're metamei de'ah d'shachar, im kol zeh, Lashon though is im kol zeh, metarin, including kamara broin, alma de'in sheyach and afilu l'de'ah d'shachar. In the Yavitz, you have two conflicting sentences. You have one sentence where it says, de'ah d'shachar is tahar, and another sentence he says, it's not even de'ah d'de'ah. So, the way that Tzemach Tzedek is presenting it is, it's taka not de'ah d'shachar, and that's why it's tar, kamara broin is tar, it's taka not even closely related to blood. That's the Tzemach Tzedek. There are many other achreinim that we could discuss. Obviously, we don't have time for everything. There was just one nekuda, and one of the achreinim that I thought was geschmack to mention. The Shut Yad Yitzchak Chel Gimel Sim Kuf Memhei was printed in 1908. Rav Mitzvah Glick, a Rav in Hungary. He makes the point. He says, we have red, we have black, and we have this brown. It's essentially in the middle. And as we said, scientifically, it has some red, it has some black. Surely you see in the Achreinim, they're not sure, is it red, is it black? So he says, why is it black tamei? Gemara says, Hi shachar ademhu al shalaka. Says, do you think red just turns into black like this? There's probably some kind of process. The red slowly turns into black. What do you think the red looks like when it's halfway between red and black? Pashtus, that would be brown. So a tava leitasik kvitza, it happens gradually. So you're telling me that the whole part is that red becomes black. So nu, what do you think brown is? Brown is red, turning into black. So certainly you can't be makel in it. And he says in Treifus we say kol shesoifoi, if we see that it's on track to become problematic, so surely you say that it's a problem right now. It's not like a shmak of art. Of course, everything can be debated, but he's talking one of the machminim. Not saying it has to. We're just saying that if red can become black, so kol sheken can become brown.
It's still fresh. If it didn't do that, why? Then it means it's not. You would have turned brown and black while still red, while still warm.
Just saying, black is further away from red. You're telling me that black is, which is so far away from red, is afal b'kein a maratame. So for sure, brown is a lot closer to red.
You look at these brown maros. If you see that
We're not talking about an actual mara transforming into black before us. We're talking about shachar is that it turned into black inside the woman. So, and then it emerges as shachar. So brown means it emerged from the woman somewhere in the middle. Just to address, one more point to address is how this psak spread. So we already mentioned that in Eretz Yisrael, the Teplik Rav came from Ukraine, and he had a lot of big impact on many of the big Meirah in Yerushalayim. With regards to America, I just want to quote from a sefer called Tziyunei Tara. The author was Rabbi Tzin Yakubovitz of Bnei Brak. He was a Satmar Chassid. He passed away 10 years ago. And this is a big chibur, multi-volume work on Nida. It was printed in the last 20, 30 years. So when he goes through this inyan, after he summarizes the shittas, he gets a little tripped up on why we talk of being mekel. And he says, check out this, the Sefer Mishnas Yaakov. Mishnas Yaakov is Rabbi Yaakov Leibovich. He's known in those circles, in Hungarian circles, as the Kapisher Rav. And apparently he was one of the heads of Isachtus. So a lot of people quote him, including the Tarak Halacha, or Farkash quotes him, Sheka'es pashto ha'hayra lahakal. So you see, he's on the record saying, I think he wrote this in the Chafs, he's like attesting to the fact that pashto ha'hayra, he witnessed the psak change, the shift. So Yakubovitch in Tziyunei Tara says, what does he mean, pashto ha'hayra? So he says, what I think he means is that when people came to America, when Yirei Hashem started settling here, could be as late as the 40s and 50s, and they had Shilas and Brian, originally there must have still been Ma'aros that were being Machmer, but slowly, when they saw how many Shilas there are for so many women, and to be Machmer would cause real problems for husbands and wives, so they must have reached the Maskana that we have to use Koicha De'atera here. So that's what he teaches Zayin, that's what the Kapashirav meant. Interestingly, there are still Paiskim even today, at least the way they write is La'achmer. So the Shevet HaLevi, in a few places in his Chuvas in Chela Gimel, Kuf Chav Aleph, he says, we know this is Jetara. The Aruch HaShulchan says, Chalil La'achmer. He says, V'hifris B'Lashoina. The Aruch HaShulchan's getting carried away. It could be Mekel, it's Tzorech, because there are Taka G'dolim V'Toivim HaMakilim, but Mekol Makim, the Shevet HaLevi says, or Vosner, B'yom Marishenim Shal Anakim, V'chein B'yom Shesamach Lavesas Mamish, Tzorech Li'Zar Tuva, we should be Nizar. Why Chalil La'achmer? Unless there's a problem, unless they Mamish can't be Matar. So it all depends on the Reis Eini Amayra. That's the Shevet HaLevi, the way he's writing about it. And again, Chelik Dal, Siman Kuf Gimel, he says, I already said in Chelik Gimel, Da'adavar Noita Yaiser Le'isr Milahatera. If I had to describe it, it's more Asr than Mutter, Moilet Tzorech. And Ladina, many Gedolim are Machmer, so Derech Re'iyah or Eid HaBadr Groi La'achmer, unless a woman has a problem. Ritzig Avriel, he writes, Kibalti, from Shmuel Vosner, that when he started off in Bnei Brak, he was very mekel and brain, maybe under the influence of the Teplika Rav, because I think sometimes he's counted among the Talmidim. But he says after a while, Nizbaterloi, after a lot of experience, that it really is just regular blood. And especially when the Vestus is about to arrive, sometimes it's presaged by these maros. So you have to be careful. Look in Shiur Shevet HaLevi also, in Siman Kuf Peches, also written in this vein. And it seems like there is at least some movement among some of the Litvische Gedolim, Paiskim, even now, to be more stringent. Even those who are Taka Matir, B'Poyel Mamish, they don't always write, the way they write it in their Sefer, they make it sound a lot more problematic, which is interesting. And this just goes to underscore what we said, which is that the whole Inyan is Taka not very pashut at all. And otherwise, you would see those who are being matir, they should be emphasizing how unbelievably obvious it is. That's not how they're writing about it. They're saying, So, does that mean that if someone Taka sees that it's not a big problem, it's not like, kosherly tahir, it's just another day or two, Nomer Zagen. Ken Gar Zayin, could very well be that maybe there's a good basis for someone to be personally more machmer, but everyone has to, of course, reach their own decisions, their own discussions with their own Rav. One final thing, Rabbani Chabad today, so if you look in Tarak Halacha, after Parak Vav, there's a Nispach, Bedine Maris Adamim, so in the Haaretz he brings Bekitzer, a portion of the Mar Mekremis we discussed, and the Pneim he writes, Yesha Tiharu, V'yesha Daitim Lahachmir, V'yesha Chriu Lahachmir, by Deiraisa, B'bdiko B'kinuach, L'hakol by Derabanan, and anyway, he goes on to say, you need Havchano B'kiyas Rabba to tell the browns apart. The warning about not passing yourself is Kfulim Chabos, that's the way he writes it in the Sefer. Doesn't mean that B'Perel Mamash, she's more mekel. You look at our brain's Haskama, you're right, after you quote the Tzemach Tzedek, so he says, so you see from here that it should also be B'dikas, not just Ksamim, U'deloika Machmirim Meza, V'chein Kibalnu B'shimash Chachamim, and I told other Matzim and Abani Anash, and they accepted it, so that's the way he phrases it, and he also goes on to say how careful you have to be not to make mistakes. The way Rabbi Avishud writes it is, when he got Shimash Tamid Chachamim, so he's from France, so he says, he was Makabel Lamaisa to be Machmer more and Hefsek Tara, and he says, Rav Hillel Pavzner Olav Shalom told him to be Machmer Hefsek Tara, that it should be glatt, quote unquote, as much as possible, and certainly if it's deep brown. And he says, and that's the same that he's got from all the other Moedim that he's Makabel from, and to be Mekel in all browns and other B'dikas as long as there's taka no redness. Which he says is a little more stringent than Kama Merabane Anash that are Mekel Lagamra even by Hefsek Tara. Well, so that's the question. So he's saying some Rabbani Anash are Mekel Lagamra even Hefsek Tara. He was Mekal from Hillel Pevzner and other Rabbanim that at least the Hefsek Tara to be Machmer.
Still make by the first 3 days.
Yeah, right. So we mentioned last time there's some that make those chalukim. Yeah. And he points out that sometimes, this we mentioned a few times, that sometimes even the Sfarim that say to be machmir, when you meet them in person and you get shemush, they're singing a different tune. So you just to keep that in mind. But then he concludes, he says, you see, it's Eina Hayra Pshuta Klal, Loila Hakav, Loila Achmer Chas V'Shalom, Marochamu Marocha, the Paiskim are arguing, says, Halacha L'maisa, he says, in his opinion, Ramachmir for deep brown, for half sektara. Shar B'dikis Ramekel, but you still have to be very careful, and he says, Yedua, that Rabbi Marlo, B'Seif Yamav, he was machmir more, he started being machmir more in brown, because he also discovered, lots of stories like this, for some reason the Rav suddenly discovered that some of those browns were just dry blood. Okay. So we're going to have to leave it at that. So now to move on to the other topic. So if we had to sum up, right, so even though the Yaakov Emden and the Siddur Torah weren't so clear, and there's some who understood that they were saying that the heter is that it is the shachar, and they said, how does that work? Why should it be mutter for that reason? Some who still tried to explain it. There are those who also said that it's b'chlal red. What are you talking about? So what is the yesod? What is the main? If you had to describe, why are we matter? So we already saw Levushim Mordechai mentioned the idea that you could treat it as its own color. It's not red. It's not black. The brown coffee. Look at it. You don't see black. You don't see brown. It feels like it's its own color. Even though he was G'rat Machmer himself, but he mentions this idea, and that's the mahalach of how the Ramazber, even Yaakov Emden himself, was not so clear. Rabbi Avishid, that's his halachic to explain this yesod. And we can answer for the Shulchan Aruch as well. The Shulchan Aruch said only love and v'yarek. Okay, but Seif Kol Seif, the Beis Yosef and others, they say that doesn't mean only. It means anything that's not has no shaychus to red. In our opinion, this has no shaychus to red. But this leads us to the counter-argument, which is, you're telling me that it's a different color. Those who want to argue that historically it's not true, right? The idea that we mentioned, that there were once 4 colors, black and white, red and yellow-green. And we already got into that a bit last time, about colors and names and languages and history. And so the argument would be that according to Chazal and the Rishonim, it was always included in red. And the Hava minute to say otherwise could only have come up in the last few hundred years. So this is an argument that's only come up in the last couple of decades. Some barichas, some shorter, some more lepupula, some takaminit. So I want to focus ledugma on one of the people making this argument, and that is Rabbi Yirmiyah Cohen. He's described as the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Yakar in Tzvas. He's one of the characters in Tzvas. He's actually a little notorious that he wrote a kuntras against Breslov a couple of years ago. He got everybody upset at him. And then Rabbi Stritsky came out and said, oh, now you're upset at him. He's been speaking against Chabad before. You shouldn't be surprised. So definitely interesting character. Not afraid to cause controversy. So he has a kuntras that's 130 pages long to explain why it's all one big, huge mistake. So I'm going to be masakim his argument. Right, so in the Mishnah in Nida it says, Chamisha dam tmeim be'isha, ha'adem ha'shachar, chikaren karkoim, chameme adamo, chamazuk. So he starts off by making the point that what the Mishnah means is there are completely different varieties of red, and it's not like if you just water down this red, you'll get to that red. They're not all just on the same spectrum, not different shades of the same thing. And he goes through Shakla V'Tarya, Gemaras, Shainim. Our Chashulchan touches on this. Our Chashulchan says, Yosef Nidali Leimer, the Kol Elu Minidam Him Adregas Chalukas Lagamni Zamizeh, Loishal Zeh Yosef Adam Mizeh Ba'emek. It's a Menacher. Before him, the Chachmas Adam also said, Nidali Shein Ninyan Dal Maros Halalu Zeh Lamayla Mizeh, Kol Ach V'Echad Yesh Nitzav B'Fnei Atzmai. And he starts mentioning the 4 reds that the Seichrim of his time already used in their business. And then he points out that this is actually the Tzemach Tzedek. That Tzemach Tzedek we mentioned earlier, the Mafteches, with that little hara there. So Simon Kuf Chav Daled. So what does the Tzemach Tzedek say there? He starts off, we'll get to the question later, but at the end of the Tshuva, the Tzemach Tzedek says, you can't say that it's all just one, range of red, that just one is redder than the next. Because then, how can you say, Amayk of each one is tamei, and the deha of each one is tahar. if they're all in the same range. The daya of this is the omek of the next one. So is it the daya of the top one and its tar, or is it the omek of the next one and its tamei? So obviously you have to say that the lavade tzorich leima shadal maros al muvad hashinuyim sheish b'neihem b'flagas ha'edem oid zeis yeshini b'neihem be'eichos u'mehusa admumis. So bazai metamei adama and yayin amazug could be two different things. Okay, so if we assume that they're different, we can still ask which one is stronger and weaker than, even different reds. Different reds are stronger and weaker than each other. Is it the order of the Mishnah or a different order? And we'll see that Tzemach Tzedek himself discusses that, and Tzemach Tzedek has a suffix a little bit about the yayin. The yayin is at the end. Does that mean it's the weakest? Because in other Makayos it sounds like wine is stronger. So this Rabbi Cohen found the Metzia in Reb Saja Goyen in his Pirush on Sefer Yetzirah, of all places. And Reb Saja Goyen writes there that we have colors, so even when you have two separate colors, there's always a memutza between the two. And he writes, "U'kamoishe pirashnu ben yonei mitzvahs hanida, she'yesha mara, there's a mara that's between the tzeva ha'adama and the tzeva ha'karkoim. And there's between the tzeva ha'karkoim and the tzeva ha'yayin, and between the yayin and the odem, and between the odem and the shocher. And because we can't really tell them apart so well, so we're matama everything in between. So it sounds like from here that red is the odem is the strongest, then comes wine, then comes karkam, and the weakest, it would seem, is the tzeva ha'adama. And then we can say that the metamei tilson and the basar tzali b'shamai is machmer b'sil is mekel. Now we include it. We should say now we also are metamei. They must be even weaker. And the fact is, Yerushalmi that says that the reason why b'shamai we're metamei those things is because they're similar to metamei adama. So it fits nicely to say that they're even weaker than the weakest one of the maros atmeim. Of course, this is all a much greater arichas there. Also, he has to explain why the mission is in a different order. He says, Da Odaim is Dam Hamaka, as the Rambam describes, Taka in Mishnah Torah, that you want to check, when you want to compare. So you take the first spurt of blood, when you do bloodletting, and you put that in a kais. He says if you do that, it's a very, very dark red, it's almost close to black. And then Yayin Amazag, it's hard to know. Like we said, it's the end of the Mishnah. Reb Saja Goyen listed it after the red. It's also hard to know what wine are we talking about. B'chlal, the wine back then seemed to have been stronger. The Chazal are being moizig. Today we're not moizig the yayin. So maybe, he says, maybe just like the strength today seems to be weaker, so maybe the color as well. Hard to know. Maybe we wouldn't have to add any water today to get the color of wine. Karkoim, a bunch of Rishonim say karkoim is always saffron, the spice. And metamei adama, we'll get to, he did his research. Tilson is fenugreek. And that and basar tzalui are the weakest and most similar to metamei adama. Then he asks, could it be that there are other shades of red that are so different that we would never have a suffix, but we're matama them anyway because we don't want to start making chilukim? So he says that's essentially Tzemach Tzedek's question. Tzemach Tzedek's question there was, that it's tamei, yeshlis topic, is that we're taka not sure, anything we see, maybe it's one of the maros, or it's the dea, and therefore it's deiraisa, or there's some things that we taka have no shayla about, but we're machmirim derech chumra. So he quotes him at Tzemach Tzedek in the middle. Tzemach Tzedek says, Rashi says that if you put too much water in the wine, if you're moizig it too much, so then that would be like a maratar. So he says, Abazai, Tzemach Tzedek says, following that logic, we should be able to create a maratar ourselves. We don't know exactly which wine, but let's get our wine. And the wine, Tzemach Tzedek says, we have yain anikar France. He says, which presumably is French wine, is that a lot less red than Fontec. That's what he calls it. So Abazai, let's take the weakest one, the France, and then pour a lot of water into it. And at some point, we're going to reach a state where we're going to say this can't be included in what Chazal meant when they said yayin hamazug, especially if you consider it to be the weakest one on the list. It's at the end of the Mishnah. And then now what about that matter? You're going to tell me that we're still being machmer in that matter because I'm not sure? It can't be. I watered it down so much. So Muslim Zag and Taka that there are some things that are not in Isser Deiraisa, but we're still machmer. Although after that, Tzemach Tzedek then said that's all according to the assumption that they're all one range. Once you say that they're different, unclear what the maskan is. From there, Rabbi Cohen gets to the famous Alter Rebbe in Kuf Bechesev Beis, that the Alter Rebbe says, "Achshav she'enanu bekim, gzeiras chacham ma'achreinu mechach me'agamara, gzeiras hagoinim she'achar hagamara," one or the other. L'tamei kol ma'arish chayres v'admumis b'zman hazeh, which we're not baki. So he actually goes to research. He says, could we actually pinpoint when this started, that we're talking about machmer? Because the Gemara doesn't mention this gzeira. The Gemara says, different Amiroim didn't want, there's no gzeira. Rishonim, right, B'zman hazeh, v'anu achshav. So he says, he started going through, she'iltis, bahag, rasag, chuvas hagoyim, even to the Rif. He says, you could see that it seems like they're getting less and less familiar, but no one actually ever comes out and says, there's a gzeira across the board. The earliest is essentially the Eshker, the Rambam, the Dovid. So he says it seems that it was a bit of an evolution, that as time went on, they got less and less confident. Rav Tzaddik Garden is already saying that we're machmir in all the maros that are in the middle of this range. Doesn't mean that there are other maros that might be totally different. That might still be tahar in his time. And then by the time you get to the Yishayim, it became so ungenommen that they treat it like a gzeira. He explains what's the reason. Two things. Number one, probably over time it became hard to identify exactly what the maros in the Mishnah are. He quotes Maram Rottenberg that says that Reb Shimshon of Troy used to aser even white stains because one of the reasons is the lo yadin mao k'metamei basar tzali. We don't know exactly what metamei basar tzali is, so maybe everything is that mara that's tomei. Of course, l'maisa we're not machmer that much, but you have this shit in some Yishenim and Ashkenaz. But it's interesting that he's saying we don't even know what metamei basar tzali is. And the second point is that already at the time of the Meroim we see how difficult it was to fully master all the differences. So that just intensified. And he adds that it's not just, every Mara isn't even just one thing. Each Mara could have a range within itself. A range of Adama, a range of Karkoim. And he adds it's also pashut hard. According to that, you have to actually check. You have to have some karkoim, you have to have some dam, you have to have all these things, and you're supposed to compare the maros to that. What's hard to obtain if you're not sure exactly. So it seems that there were some things they knew were not taka really a suffix deraisa, but they still answered it just to make sure that there's no confusion. Then he gets to Brown. And he gives the whole akdama again about history and language and names, and how all the new words in Hebrew, all the names for colors, they're taking things that used to be included in other colors, and they're saying it's no longer overlapping. Green is green, yellow is yellow, what's yellow isn't green, what's green isn't yellow, that wasn't the way it was before, and that's what we're accomplishing now. So for example, the grays, there was no word for gray. They took the word afer, they turned it into afar, but told them the very faint grays were considered whites, and the very dark grays were considered blacks, and then something in the middle, you might find them say, bein shachar l'lavan, or loy shachar v'loy lavan. So Rabbi Zai says if brown is also a new thing, so Rabbi Zai, the browns were just divided among the other colors. The really yellow ones were yellow, the really red ones were red. It's not like they had no name, they were included in the other ones. And now this name is taking them away from there, and now they have only this name. He says, we know brown is a recent term in German. He claims 500 years ago, maybe it's a little bit more. We see Rishonim never mention this word. They mention all kinds of other words in German, gel and green and bloy. They don't mention braun. So, until the Achreinim start mentioning it. So, he says it's interesting, Zohar. The Zohar talks about Chachmas HaPartzuf, and part of the Chachmas HaPartzuf includes the hair. And it says there's Lavan, Adam, Yadek, and Shachar. And that's Keneged, Chesed, Gevurah, Teferes, Amachos, Dal, Reis, Hashem, Avaya. Viter, you keep on seeing, there are many other examples like this, but you keep on seeing the four colors. Obviously people have brown hair. Where is the brown hair included in the Zohar? Obviously, in either the yellow or the red. The big example is the Para Aduma. You ask people, what's a Para Aduma? So you picture a bright red cow. And that's why it's so rare, because no one ever saw a bright red cow. Says, no, that's not the pshat. The pshat is, it's a brown cow. Many cows have spots. You're looking for a pure brown cow. And the Gemara says, Lama tamei yakarin, hayol shtei sayre shchayres, or levanis paislis ba. Because even two black hairs, two white hairs, that's very hard to find. If you look at brown cows, you'll see they also have some other hair. That's what makes it hard to find. But because we already, in the last 400 years, brown and red completely split, so now we're getting confused. There's a Rashi. Rashi says, Stam susam adumim heim. A chamor is black and susam are adumim. You ever saw a bright red horse? Obviously, brown horses, the standard color of horses is included in adumim, etc. He says there's a ramak that says adama is because it's ma'adima mikaya chadin. Stam adama, there's no red adama. So but what about what we consider to be like pure brown, which is to our eyes not red? He says, Zagan, that's also included in red, because it has to go somewhere. And it's too far away from yellow. Musman Zagan, that stam brown amal, was also considered to be red, not like the horses. All these animals, they're not bright red. They're pretty even brown, and yet that itself is called red. So that's the argument he wants, and that explains why none of the Rishonim ever spoke about it. Where were they this whole time? Taka didn't exist. They understood that it was part of red. The question only arose once the word brown really settled in. Two more minutes. His main punchline is that he went and checked what the Mishnah is talking about, specifically metamei adama. So metamei adama, the Gemara says, where do you go? The Gemara says different places. Bikas beis kerem. Kiva says bikas yodafat. Yesi says bikas sichni. Shimon says bikas ginoisar. He says we can try to figure out where these places are. Some places are easier than others. You can't always trust. Sometimes the name in Arabic seems to capture the original name. It preserves the original name, but you can't always trust it. So there's a place called Majad al-Karum that's bikas kerem in Arabic. Okay, maybe that's a little iffier. But he says Sichni. We have a Kfar Sichnin. Makes sense that it's there. Yodafat, Yosef Matisyo, Josephus, his whole career was, when he was still a general or a military leader, was near Yodafat. He speaks about it a lot. He describes the mountains, the hills, he describes the whole scene, the scenery. We can identify where it is. He also describes Bikas Ginoisar Dafka, and he describes exactly how to find it. It's easy to find. So he says, the Goydel Atshuka, Aitaka wanted to get to the bottom of this, so Aitaka went to all these places, and I collected a lot of samples, 40 samples of earth, and put it in water. And he said, all of these, Atzad HaShava, is that you would not describe any of these as having a red hue. There's no redness there. Pretty much brown earth, the way you imagine earth. So there are slight differences between these valleys, not that much of a difference. He says he spoke to researchers, geologists. Could it be that the earth changed so dramatically in the last 1,500 years? I mean, Gemara, Chazal, 1,500 years ago. They said, yeah, we know that, things accumulate, layers of earth accumulate, but no, based on the amount of time that elapsed and based on the conditions, no, especially, he says, he went to where there was construction, where they were digging into the ground, so he took earth from inside the ground, not just from the surface. So no. And his whole mahalach of Rabbi Sajagai, that it's the talk of the last one in the Mishnah. So it makes sense. The Mishnah is going from very red, fainter and fainter and fainter, and the final red in the Mishnah is Bechlal, what we call brown. That's the metamei adama. And now you take the Basar Tzali, which is even weaker than that. So he says, we can try that also. So he says he put up a roast, and he captured everything that dripped out of it from the beginning till the end. So when it finished dripping, it was a mix of colors. Once he stirred the whole thing and it settled, it looked kamat like metamei adama. It was lahafli how similar it was to metamei adama. And then he says he took maros that he knew were blood, and they started off as red and they dried to brown. And he looked, and they looked very similar to these shades, so it all stems very nicely. And so his argument is, as well, part of his argument is that it can't be that if it starts off as one thing and turns into something else, that it would turn from a mara tamei to tahar so easily. So Muslim Zagan, that even a plain brown is a mara tamei. Of course, the Meirahira, that the Paskin, they say that you could tell the difference. Part of what he's arguing, I guess, is that you can't really tell the difference. There's also a video of his on YouTube. For those who are interested, you look it up online, Ashkecha Miyayin, and there's a video of him with Karkoim and metamei adama. So his maskana taka is lahachmir meikar hadin, and he even got some maskamas from Litvische Welt. And there's even an article on Bechadre Charedim about the shturim that he made and how the Chuvas von Hagas from Moshe Sternbach seems to mamash fully agree with him. And in Chelik Zion, he quotes his kuntras like Takala Halacha. How are you going to fa'en for it? The way to fa'en for it is that all the browns in the Gemara are browns that are noit ladmimus. Brown that has no admimus is not red. That's what you're going to have to say. There's no clear-cut, the Adama, no, Muslim Zagan that it's not the Adama that he thought. It's something redder than that. There was red Adama. Anyway, it's a very interesting discussion, and it's interesting to see that there are mamish people who want to make this argument, and especially considering how the din, as we saw, is a fairly recent psak and halacha, and the final installment, Mir Hashem, will talk about those who started a war, a fight against those who are paskening lehakal too much, even when it is noita la'adam.